Greetings to friends, friends of Wyoming Catholic College, former students, and all those interested in knowing more about Dante. In this three-part series, which we're calling Dante and the Year of Mercy, we'll focus on the three canticles of the comedy, which was certainly Dante's greatest work, and some would say perhaps the single greatest work of the imagination of the West. Whether or not you're prepared to give that compliment to the comedy, it is certainly true that Dante keeps company with Homer, Virgil, Shakespeare, Sophocles, and Dostoevsky. But at the same time, although the comedy is, say, one of the top 5 works of Western literature ever written, Dante's comedy has a peculiarly medieval taste to it, which makes it feel quite a bit different from, say, a Homer, or a tragedy for the stage, or a realistic novel. And this peculiarly medieval taste can sometimes get in the way of our appreciation. I know I've had students say to me before that they had heard so much about the comedy that they were looking forward to reading it. But when they actually got to it, they were surprised by its form, its medieval form. Let me then briefly try to explain what I mean by this. The comedy more than once has been likened to a medieval cathedral. If you've ever been to an old world Gothic cathedral, then you know that in addition to the soaring vaults overhead that rise sometimes to 150 feet, you have complicated stone columns, decorative friezes, ornate stained glass and sculpture all over the facade of the church. These medieval cathedrals then had an all-encompassing order. Every part has a place, and every part has a corresponding part across the way. At the same time, the face of the church, the facade, is divided up into hierarchical layers. But in the midst of this geometrical and ordered architectural system, the artistic work on the cathedral is marked by an extraordinary diversity, a huge variety of carvings and stories and details of flora and fauna. In a similar way, Dante's poem is famous for its complexity. At the most basic level, of course, it tells the story of a man lost in a dark wood, saved by the ancient Roman poet Virgil. This Roman poet, we will learn, was commissioned by a whole hierarchy of saints who were eager to help the lost pilgrim. The pilgrim, Dante, travels through hell, climbs the mountain of purgatory, and ascends to the starry realms of heaven to speak to the saints in paradise. But while Dante is undergoing this journey, he has hundreds of conversations with particular historical characters who tell their own unique stories. Thus, the pilgrim goes through dozens of well-placed regions, all of which are harmoniously situated with relationship to all the others. The literary world through which the pilgrim travels, then, has a precise architecture. And you can map out accurately all of these regions in hierarchic progression, as so many Florentine artists tried to do in the centuries after Dante. But in addition to this well-ordered architectural space, we're blown away in the poem, not just by its order, its architecture, but by its abundance. In every one of these realms, we hear sinners or saints tell their own stories. Just like in the midst of the order of the architecture of the cathedral, we find stories or personalized figures on the windows or in the stone carvings. Thus the comedy, like the cathedral, is constructed analogously to the universe God created. On the one hand, you have constellations, stars and seasons which move in recurring patterns. You have seas and oceans and continents which stay put within their assigned boundaries. But you also have millions of unique faces, people, minds, languages, and local histories which exist in the midst of that governing architecture of time and space. You could say then that Dante constantly zooms out to give you a view of the whole, but then right away zooms in to give you an interior view of any one of a number of particularized human hearts. Dante's poetry then uses a kind of poetic telescope, as well as a literary microscope. But this rich complexity which calls forth from us such ardent admiration can also account why this poem is so difficult to appreciate on a first or even a second read. Like my students, I have to admit that I didn't appreciate the comedy at all the first time I read it. I got lost in the confusing details. To put this into concrete terms, note this. Dante uses around 1,500 proper names throughout the three canticles. There are names of rivers in obscure parts of Italy. There are names of geographical regions, woods, mountains, cities, neighborhoods, taken from Florentine medieval history. Guido Cavalcanti, Brunetto Latini, Pier delle Vigne, Guida da Montefeltro, Cacciaguida, and so on. In fact, Dante intentionally employs a huge cast of characters taken from every era of history, right back to Adam and the biblical patriarchs, down through classical antiquity and up to Dante's contemporary day. And as you can imagine, scholars have counted these things. Dante has 128 speaking characters in his poem, and another 236 characters who have some non-speaking action assigned to them. There are 210 characters, then, who make an appearance on the stage of the Inferno alone. Try to imagine a play or a film which contains so many actors. Thus, even though I said that Dante stands in the company of Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, and Homer, and although he might be as great and compelling and as potentially life-transformative as those authors, it's understandable why he's a lot more difficult to get into. But in addition to all these references to people, Dante managed to create a poem which echoes itself. In other words, when you get to paradise, you hear echoes of what Dante had said way back in the Inferno. Or sometimes Dante will slightly rewrite what he had said just a few canti earlier. He almost wants you to come to a hasty opinion early on which he can later correct and rewrite. He's willing to leave you at first only half informed. The comedy is also like a medieval tapestry. You have those threads which weave in and out. They disappear to sight for a while, but then those themes reemerge later. A third obstacle to appreciating Dante, and that is the rhetorical structure of his poetry. For example, Dante likes to use all kinds of techniques his medieval contemporaries thought made learned poetry excellent. He loves to use periphrasis. That is, he loves to refer to things indirectly and obliquely rather than just stating the name. For example, in Canto 1, Dante does not say, "The sun was shining on a hill," but rather, in Inferno 1:13, "But when I reached the foot of a hill, I looked up and saw its shoulders, arrayed in the first light of the planet that leads men straight no matter what their road." Dante has given us a little riddle. We have to untie the knot of his rhetoric. It's an interesting way to think about poetry, isn't it? Dante chooses to make what he is saying more obscure. He hides his thoughts in words, like a woman wearing a veil. He wants to protect what he's saying and tuck it away inside a protective covering. In the fourth place, we have to keep in mind that Dante was a master of the debates of his age, and he was also a master of the literature of antiquity. And this also makes it difficult for us sometimes who are reading the poem 700 years later. Dante probably had almost the entirety of the Aeneid memorized, or at least Book 6, which describes the journey of the Roman hero Aeneas down into the underworld. You might want to pull your copy of the Aeneid off the shelf and reread Book 6 before reading the Inferno. Well, Dante constructs his own spiritual journey as a Christian counter-journey to the virtuous Aeneas's own journey as described in classical antiquity. Aeneas was said in antiquity to be first and foremost a man of great piety. He was loyal to his city. He was loyal to his father and his family. He was devout before the gods. He was brave in battle. He was a shepherd of his men, and so on. And so Dante's journey then is a kind of quest to rediscover in himself the best of the pagan world. Dante the poet, on occasion, then, echoes moments in Virgil's Aeneid, sometimes word for word, at the very moment that Dante the character, or Dante the pilgrim, is passing over those parts of hell that the legendary hero Aeneas was said to have traversed. And finally, it's a famous fact that the more you read in Dante, the harder it gets. A British scholar, Philip Wicksteed, writing in 1922, put it this way: "The successive cantiche of Dante's comedy appeal to successively narrowing circles of readers. Many who are fairly acquainted with representative portions at least of the Inferno, in whose minds Dante ranks high as a poet on the strength of them, have but the vaguest conception even of the Purgatorio. Many readers of the Purgatorio, to whom Dante is a prophet and teacher as well as poet, find their high anticipations perplexed and perhaps chilled when they come to the Paradiso. Wicksteed's rhetoric is lofty, but what he is explaining is a phenomenon that all teachers of Dante today frequently discuss. Students generally love the Inferno because it's exciting and violent and memorable. They have a harder time getting into the Purgatorio, but they are also often completely lost in the Paradiso. A title from an online article in Slate from a couple of years ago captures this phenomenon succinctly in this way: why doesn't anyone read Dante's Paradiso? The inherent difficulty to the canticle is due to the fact, I think, that Dante structured his poem to get higher and lighter, the more abstract as we ascend and get closer to God. In Paradiso, Dante keeps saying that he can barely recall all that which he saw, and of that which remains in his memory, he has a hard time finding words for what he experienced. Well, so much for the difficulties. They're summed up well by a recent writer to whom we will return at the end of this lecture, Rod Dreher, author of How Dante Can Save Your Life, who says that he had always been a little afraid of Dante. Before he read Dante in his early 40s, he had thought of the comedy as a kind of literary Mount Everest, something which you know about, admire from afar, but never hope to actually summit. And so here we are. We know that the comedy is a famous piece of literature, that it has great depth and radiating beauty. And we know that it will present a major challenge at the same time because of the elusive nature of the poetry, because of the historical knowledge Dante presumes, and because he's trying to do the impossible, to use words to talk about those aspects of reality which are so true, so dense, and so beautiful that they exceed language. It is in part for this reason that Wyoming Catholic College wanted to offer a course on Dante, to build a bridge from where we are over the difficulties so that we can enter into the poem with a greater appreciation. But the college sensed something else as well, that although this great poem has been admired intensely for the past 700 years in Italy, in England, in America, by scholars, by poets, by artists, and even by African American slaves, even though all this is the case, there seems to be a special urgency of reading this poem today. Pope Francis, for example, issued a statement on May 4th, 2015, that is on the day that the Italian government was celebrating the 750th anniversary of Dante's birth. Francis asked Catholics to read or reread the comedy in preparation for the Year of Mercy. He says Dante's comedy issues an invitation to rediscover the lost or obscured meaning of our human path, and to hope to see again the glowing horizon on which the dignity of the human person shines in fullness. He continues, the comedy still has much to say and offer. It promises to provide an authentic discovery of the self, the world, and the profound and transcendent meaning of existence. In sum, for Pope Francis, Dante is, quote, a prophet of hope, herald of the possibility of the profound transformation of every man and woman, end quote. In other words, Pope Francis thinks the occasion to read Dante could bring not just entertainment, but radical transformation of the human heart in a way which could potentially make society more just, more loving, and more merciful. It's truly an extraordinary claim about the power of this poem. Could it really be that an old poem could radically redirect the course of our world, which seems so eager to destroy itself? On this side of the Atlantic, there's an influential journalist many of you will know, Rod Dreher, who wrote a book which came out in the early months of 2015. It's called How Dante Can Save Your Life. Another exceptionally bold claim about the value of reading Dante. Dreher claims that although he had no inclination to medieval poetry whatsoever, he stumbled across the comedy in a bookstore. As I mentioned, he had always wanted to read the work because he had heard it was important, but had always been daunted by it. But at this time in his life, he was predisposed to it because he himself was suffering from a severe depression, brought on by his failed attempt to reconnect to his home community. And so there he was, full of sorrow and despair in the bookstore when he opened the Inferno and read the opening lines. Midway in the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. Dreher says that he kept reading the poem, and that at each step along the way was astonished that a medieval poet, writing 700 years before, knew the human heart so well that he could write a poem which seems to have been written just for him. He says that he saw aspects of himself depicted in Dante's Sinners. He found that Dante exposed parts of himself which he barely knew existed. At once, Dante was able to uncover things in his heart which had been hidden from his view, both limitations, but also he uncovered the real dreams, the deep-down desires. These are extraordinary testimonies, not just to the poem's power, but also to the urgency. I need to read it again, even in 2015 and 2016 contemporary America. Well, this is my goal then. As the instructor of this online college-level course, to help readers, to help you, come to appreciate the depth of this poem, to understand its extraordinary and radical message, and to recognize the contemporary relevance, perhaps even urgency, of this medieval poem. At this point, I'd like to address some practical matters of this course. The translation I will be quoting from in these lectures is that done by Robert and Jean Hollander in the early 2000s. Now, there are many good translations of Dante. There's an important translation by the mid-20th century scholar Charles Singleton. There's also other good recent translations, one done by the literary scholar at Providence College, Anthony Esselin. There's one by a great Cambridge Dante scholar, Robin Kirkpatrick, published by Penguin. And there's a bulky one, which is very literal, published by Oxford. I like editions with facing page translations, that is, Italian on the one side and English on the other. And I encourage my students, many of whom don't know Italian, to nevertheless occasionally take a look at the side with the Italian. Sometimes, especially if they know a bit of Latin or Spanish, they can make out something of it. And I would encourage you to do so as well. I myself will read aloud a bit here and there to give you something of the flavor of the original. I also like editions with good notes, and Hollander's are really good. In fact, they're so good that they've been recently translated back into Italian, which is quite a compliment for an American scholar. And finally, I like Hollander because he balances well a literal translation, sticking close to Dante's words, with a sense for the poetry. Other translations I have mentioned are more poetic, in my opinion, or more literal, but I like the balance struck by Hollander's translation. The second practical item of business is this. This is the first of 6 lectures on the first canticle of the comedy. We call each one of the 3 parts cantiche, or in English, canticles. In my next lecture, I will talk about the chapters, or what we call little songs, canti 1 to 3. In the third lecture, I'll talk about the next group of canti in Inferno, and then conclude in the 6th part by talking about the conclusion of Inferno. If you want, you can read these canti in advance, as if preparing for a class. Then you can listen to my thoughts, and hopefully, if you're watching these lectures with some friends, which my dad has promised to do, you can hold a conversation about these canti and engage both me and Dante in a kind of ongoing conversation. Alternatively, you can listen to my thoughts first and then go read the canti, preferably performing them, reading them out loud and slowly, with some of my thoughts as a bridge into the poetry. I think either of these approaches would serve you well. At this point, I'd like to transition again and spend the remainder of the time allotted to me for this introduction to providing you with a kind of panoramic view of Dante's life and times. I hope a quick sketch of the author's life will help you overcome some of those obstacles we spoke about earlier when you turn to reading the comedy for yourself. In particular, I want to talk about 2 major moments which influenced the future author of the comedy. His early work, written in his 20s as a love poet, and then his failed attempt at politics in his early 30s. Both of these experiences shaped the kind of book he later wrote and called the comedy. Dante was born in 1265 and he lived until 1321. He was born into a minor aristocratic family. Scholars think that in the early 1280s, that is when Dante was the equivalent of a freshman in college, he began to write his first poems. But they're not like the poetry he would later write in the comedy. That is, He didn't write a narrative, the story of a journey, but rather short sonnets, or at most little songs of no more than 100 lines which could be put to music. These were called canzoni. Almost all of them dealt in one form or another with falling in love, being in love, suffering when the one you love doesn't return your love, and so forth. In other words, Dante was a love poet, and he quickly gained the admiration of the upper Florentine circles through these short, powerful, melodious, and musical verses. He recalls later that he heard through his window people in the streets singing his own songs. He had the kind of fame and respect and admiration then that a smart lead singer of a rock band might have in our day. Of course, we all know something about the experience of love. You might recall those first exciting and awkward moments when you were attracted to someone, and that person perhaps was attracted to you. You worried and talked endlessly about it to anyone who was willing to listen. It was exciting and confusing and enlivening all at once. Well, medieval love poets for centuries had worked to get all this down to a precise science, a precise poetic science, because they thought only poetry was the proper vehicle to try to understand these complicated experiences of the initial moment when you were struck with desire, the moment in which you were dumped and wanted to weep, and so on. And Dante, by the time he was in his late 20s, had already written several dozen of these poems. However, around the year 1292, he gathered up 31 of these poems and arranged them in a collection, a little anthology of his own work. But he also did something unprecedented. He added an autobiographical and theological commentary which explained the occasions in which he wrote these poems. The work was called The New Life, or in Italian, La Vita Nuova. And his prose writing served as an ongoing commentary to his own poems. Dante was never one to suffer lack of self-confidence. The reason why this little book written when he was around 27 years is so interesting is because it shows Dante's early desire to elevate a popular form of writing, the love song, to the level of a theological treatise. Dante used the ordinary daily language of Italian, but in the Vita Nuova, he began to use it and to transform it to look deeper into common experiences and try to find something of that philosophical depth which had largely been the pursuit of the learned Latinate clergy. And so the story of how he came to compose these poems, as we shall see, takes on powerful theological overtones. His poetic story of his birth, or new life, begins with a description of the 9th hour of the 9th day of his 9th year, when he first laid eyes on Beatrice. Recalling this event almost 18 years later, he says, quote, "At that very moment, and I speak the truth, the vital spirit, the one that dwells in the most secret chambers of the heart, began to tremble so violently that even the most minute veins of my body were strangely affected. And trembling, it spoke these words, Ecce Deus fortior me qui veniens dominabitur mihi, Latin for, here is a God stronger than I who comes to rule over me." As Dante explains, he knew from then on that he would be a servant of love forever. There would never be a moment in which he would try not to be in love. Everything else felt flat and boring and dull. But for Dante, love is not just exciting, it's ennobling. He believed, along with the vernacular literary tradition, that when you fall in love, then you are braver, more virtuous, and so on. But most importantly, you're more alive and vital. You see the world with a new vigor. It just so happened that the next time Dante saw Beatrice was exactly 9 years later, and she greeted him, or in his own words, "She greeted me so miraculously that I seemed at that moment to behold the entire range of possible bliss. I became so ecstatic that, like a drunken man, I turned away from everyone and sought the loneliness of my room, where I began thinking of this most gracious lady." Of course, each one of these happy encounters, or some of the times in which Beatrice did not greet Dante, became the occasion for writing one of the 31 poems he includes in his anthology. Dante says that he nervously anticipated these chance encounters with Beatrice, and that when he actually did see her, his heart was so full of love, and he, quote, "could not have considered any man my enemy," end quote. But these experiences, although joyful, were at the same time almost painful. Dante plays on the Italian pun of amore and amaro. Amore means love, and amaro means bitter. The experience of love, in addition to being joyful, was frightening and painful at the same time. At one point, Dante even says that falling in love is akin to the process of death, because as you stare at the miraculous apparition of beauty in front of you, your other vital functions begin to fail. My college students seem to understand all of this very well. And so things might have continued, but Dante said he had a kind of epiphany, the second movement in his new birth, in his new life. In the middle of the book of the Vita Nuova, Dante says that he realized that all of his poetry had merely focused on his responses to Beatrice when he received her greeting. Quote, I felt forced to find a new theme, one nobler than the last. And this new theme was not his own suffering, condition, and love, but the praise of this beautiful lady. But he didn't feel ready to sing this praise yet. Beatrice was too great for his words at that time. And so he wrote a poem about how he wished he could write an adequate poem. In this famous poem, which he will refer to again in the comedy, called Ladies Who Have an Understanding of Love, he wrote that wherever his lady goes, love drives a killing frost into vile hearts that freezes and destroys what they are thinking. Should one insist on looking at her, he is changed to something noble, or he dies. We see here an important theme in Dante's works. He encounters with parts of reality which are so true, deep, and beautiful that they resist our attempts to describe them adequately in language. Earlier, I alluded to the two literary cultures of Dante's day. One, the literary culture of the secular and chivalric courts, which wrote in the vernaculars of Europe and about the bliss of earthly romantic love. And the other, which wrote about a joy you had to wait for until you got to heaven. But already we can see Dante is intentionally trying to bring these two literary cultures into perfect harmony, to overcome their division. And thus, his story, although it's fairly similar to other stories of courtly love, is nevertheless adorned with rich theological language. For example, in his dreams, love speaks to him in Latin, the medieval language of the Bible. And Dante calls those times in which he saw Beatrice on the street not meetings, but rather Beatrice's apparition to him. These moments in which he is caught up and overwhelmed by the strong feelings of love and is made to feel a kind of unity with all men, he calls transfigurations. In chapter 24, Dante writes about a vision of love. And it truly seemed to me that my heart was happy, so happy that it did not seem to be my heart because of this change. Thus, the poet uses a language steeped in theology to describe his earthly experience of love. Even Beatrice's name means the Blessed Lady. Dante puns on this name throughout, calling her his Blessed One, or Beatrice. Before proceeding, I want to make 2 points to summarize what we have seen in the Vita Nuova so far. 1. For the young Dante, as Dostoevsky would put it 500 years later, it is literally the case that beauty can save the world. Beatrice is a miracle who comes into the world. But it's important to recognize right away that an encounter with her is also an encounter with God. And it's not necessarily pleasant. An encounter with God and with his heavenly things is fearful. It promotes a terror because it's a power which completely exceeds our ability to understand. It is, as we have said, that mingled experience of love, amore, and bitterness, amaro. But this mixed experience of pain and joy is essential to the cleansing and purgative experience of love. Love not only wakes you up from your dream, that is, from you leading your ordinary and uninspired life, but it also leaves you discontent at each stage. The bitterness of love refines, at the same time it inspires. 2. The second observation pertains to Dante's goal as a poet. Dante repeatedly writes about his attempt to capture in language and the music of its sounds the overwhelming experience of love. Pause for a moment to consider the difficulty of this task of translating those infinitely complex feelings of the heart into the expression of the speech. But Dante, as poet, is trying to do the impossible. He's trying to capture in words those rich, complicated inner experiences of the heart and incarnate them in language. Well, according to Dante, the first phase of his new life was meeting Beatrice. The second phase of his new life was beginning to take up poetry in which he sang not about himself, but in praise of love. If Dante's poetic career had ended here, he would be admired, probably, but only read by graduate students at University of Chicago, like any one of his largely forgotten contemporaries, Guido Guinizelli or Guido Cavalcanti. But as he relates, he was forced to go to a new level. In the early 1290s, the woman he had written about, Beatrice, whom he thought was a physical sign of the presence of God in Florence, died. That is, in Dante's words, Florence was left bereft and deserted of this transcendent beauty. In fact, Dante uses the strongest possible allusion to capture this moment. He quotes what the prophet Jeremiah had said about Jerusalem. How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? She was mistress of the nations. She that was mistress of the nations is now become as a widow. Dante then not only uses biblical language to talk about Beatrice, but he uses a verse which is chanted in the liturgy of Holy Week to describe man's orphaned state without the presence of Christ. Dante writes that in the months that followed her death, he sought consolation through writing about his grief, and later in writing love poems to other women. But nothing served as an adequate substitute. Until one night, he had a visionary dream in which he saw his soul leave his body, pass through the heavenly spheres, past the planets, past the stars, until it came to heaven and saw Beatrice among the saints. There Dante was struck by the radiance of Beatrice, more beautiful now than in life, because now the veil which had shielded her beauty in life was fully removed. In this way, Dante's Vita Nuova closes with a promise to his readers. Dante says that after a period of intense study, he will write something about Beatrice which no man had ever said about a woman before. It's fun to speculate about what this poem would have been like if Dante had the leisure and the libraries of Florence and the next decade to work on it. But his goals and plans were rather interrupted. If Dante spent his early 20s writing love poems, he spent his late 20s and early 30s as a soldier and a politician in Florence. It was around the year 1300 that Dante entered politics in his Republican city, and his career was advancing nicely. And again, it could have easily been the fact that he could have spent the rest of his life engaged in Florentine political affairs and never returned to that promise at the end of the Vita Nuova, in which case we would not be having this course. But something happened to cut Dante's political career short and made him return to the poetry of his youth. In fact, the single worst thing that did happen to him his entire life after the death of Beatrice. He was exiled by his political opponents from his family, friends, and possessions for life. In 1302, while he was away on business, the pro-papal faction seized control of the government and took their chance to get rid of a number of enemies in the opposing faction. Dante received news on the road that if he returned to Florence, he would be executed. But ironically, although this was the most terrible event of his life, Dante later would describe this as one of the secrets for his success as a poet. Being a political exile meant that he was forced to become a party unto himself. Or, in other words, he was forced to leave the polarizing world of politics. He was forced to ask questions not about short-term solutions, but about the long-term conditions why partisanship existed in the first place. In other words, Dante describes his political exile as the key moment which resulted in his transformation from politician to prophet. To us, it seems a little strange, though, that Dante's solution to the injustice and quarrelsome divisiveness of his day was to write a poem. Pause for a moment to consider what a strange proposition that would be in our day. Isn't it the common wisdom that if you really want to get something done, then you need to start a business, go into politics, become a scientist, right? Our federal government doesn't award high-dollar grants to train poets to deal with major social problems. So what was Dante thinking? Why write poetry? How could a poem heal the world? To answer this question, we have to realize how deeply divided Dante's world was. That is, very quickly, view late medieval Florentine history with a wide-angle lens. After the fall of Rome in 476 AD, the Roman Empire, which had once upon a time included not just Italy, but had stretched from northern Africa to the Middle East, covered all of Spain and France, and extended all the way up to Scotland, was carved up into little bits which were managed by local chieftains. And yet, over the next several centuries, these chieftains slowly began to consolidate power, adding surrounding regions to their control through marriage and war. Until the point that a descendant of one of these tribes had put together a big chunk of land on the borders of modern France and Germany. His name was Charlemagne. On Christmas Day, 800 AD, he was in Rome, and he was crowned the Roman Emperor by the Pope. And then he went back up north of the Alps and continued to rule the newly reconstituted Roman Empire from his palace in Aachen. This practice of a German emperor who was nominally head of the Roman Empire, but who ruled from north of the Alps, with exceptions and interruptions, continued down to Dante's day. These Holy Roman Emperors, as they would later be called, really thought that they were the rightful successors to Caesar Augustus, Trajan, and Constantine, but they remained for some time physically absent from Italy. In the meantime, the Italian city-states grew accustomed to ruling themselves, and the church, which had to weather centuries of cultural instability, also grew accustomed to being the center of orderly society. Thus, it is no great surprise that when in the 1200s the Holy Roman Emperors began creeping back down into Italy, there was conflict. Frederick II, grandson of Frederick Barbarossa, moved his court to Palermo, Sicily, and thus had a foothold on the Italian peninsula. His illegitimate son, Manfred, who appears in the comedy, tried to continue the legacy of his father. He began moving into central Italy to bring it under more direct control. But the Italian city-states allied with the Pope, and together they in turn invited Charles of Anjou from France to counter Manfred. Manfred was defeated at the Battle of Benevento in 1266, the year after Dante was born. Thus, in a similar way to how Southerners for years lived with the memory of the Civil War, even if they had not experienced it, or to how my kids know about 9/11, even though they were not alive when it took place, Dante was born into a world which had been shaped by these opposing forces. These long-term international forces served as a kind of framework for local politics to fit into, just as politicians of a city, even if it's a very small one, will still ally themselves with either Democrats or Republicans. So too did the local political disputes in Dante's day organize themselves into imperial supporters, Ghibellines, who were largely aristocratic families, and papal supporters, so-called Guelphs, who were the new-moneyed mercantile families. Against this background of long-term division and his own personal exile, we can begin to appreciate the unique intensity of Dante's poem. Dante was the man who spent most of his adult life in exile. If you've ever spent a long time away from home, especially in a foreign country, then you know, even if it's as delightful as Burgundy or Tuscany, then after a while you start aching for home. You miss the effortlessness of life, the ease of conversation, the shared memories, and you feel you can't completely relax. Well, something like this, but probably much more keen, because medieval man was more rooted than we are in modern society, must have burned within Dante almost the whole of his mature adult life. At all times during the writing of the comedy, did Dante have this sorrowful sense of the wayfarer in exile. But at the same time, when Dante returned to writing, he increasingly wanted to fulfill that old promise he had made at the end of the Vita Nuova, the promise to write a love poem which was greater than anything that had been written before. But now his understanding of love had been forced to get deeper and broader. He was now no longer writing for himself or a few Florentine friends and aristocrats, but for the world. But the world was so bruised and broken and divided that it might not even be able to hear the love poem. But just what if he could write a poem which, by reflecting on his own journey, could awaken a spiritually sleepy world to what it had chosen to forget? What if he could make men feel that they too were in exile from the source of love? What if he could shock them, startle them, scandalize them, and shake them wide awake? And then what if he could give a picture of love which was so beautiful, so deep, and so stirring that they would, almost for the first time, feel the desire once again to come to know that love? Thus, to put it starkly, Dante did not think he was writing literature for entertainment, like a novel, but rather that he was writing almost a kind of prophetic, visionary treatise, like a Jeremiah who comes back to the city to condemn the inhabitants. And his own political exile turned out to be the key to discovering his own spiritual exile. And this, in turn, proved to be the key to writing a vision of love ever so much bigger than even what he had promised to do at the end of the Vita Nuova. And to this end, Dante set about to develop a prophetic sensibility, by which I mean the power to look down into the root causes of problems of society and awaken men to a love of goodness again, not just to propose an intelligent but temporary diplomatic answer. And so now the wayfarer, the man with a pilgrim spirit, who lived his life longing for home and knowing he would never be allowed to return, the politician, who would labor to build a society which was just and unified, and the poet, who lost sleep at night in the desperate, lovesick effort to get just the right kind of music into his language so that it would be an expression of that most mysterious interior. All three of these united to write an intense and ambitious poem, a poem which he hoped would transform the world. I'd like to end this lecture by quoting from C.S. Lewis's famous sermon, The Weight of Glory, because I think his words get at Dante's prophetic spirit as we find it in his poem. Lewis says, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in the slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. Then Lewis continues, I think with Dante's vision of the afterlife very much in mind. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption, such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them, that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. In a similar way, Dante, I believe, became a new Jonah, who set about to write a love poem, but one which could also bring about Nineveh's repentance.